Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Madelaine Moore. Madelaine is a political economist working on eco-social policies. She published several scientific articles, and recently she published a book called Water Struggles as Resistance to Neoliberal Capitalism. There she explores the history and contradiction of water grabbing, social reproductive theories, and the water trading markets in a global context. Dear Madelaine, I'm very glad and honored that you followed my invitation and that you found the time so that we can talk about your research.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Before we dig deeper into your scientific work and before we talk about your book that you recently published, could you tell me how your academic journey began?
Sure. So yeah, I wasn't someone who went through undergrad and then postgrad and stayed in the university the whole time. I did my undergrad at Melbourne, La Trobe University and Melbourne University in Australia, and then worked for the trade unions for a trade union for a year and a half, 2 years before moving to Europe. And yeah, it was in Germany that I started my master's, and from there sort of got stuck and ended up doing a PhD at Kassel University in Germany, and am now a couple of years into my postdoc here as well. So academia wasn't necessarily always the goal. I more saw myself as being active in or kind of working for sort of trade unions or kind of NGOs in a way. But I've realized that academia is a great fit for what I enjoy teaching. I enjoy working closely with people and also, of course, the research. So yeah.
Sounds nice. And did you have any academic role models?
Yeah, I think I was trying to think about this this morning, and I think in many ways, and this is sort of a positive and a negative for the German academic system, it's quite a hands-off supervisory relationship, which is good and can also be challenging when you're having challenging moments. But what it did mean for me is that I really built my own support networks, and also from that academic networks from the very kind of first days of starting my PhD. And so academic role models were as much my peers as they were, much more established academics. And there's definitely been quite a few more established academics who have kind of given me significant and really important support over the last few years. I think at the very beginning, there was a lecturer in the UK called Colin. Sadly, he's passed away now, but he really helped give me some confidence of sort of shaping a kind of a Marxist approach to studying social movements. And then, of course, my supervisors, Andreas, Bieler and Christoph, Scherrer. And later in the track, people connected to kind of the critical political economy research network and different reading groups. So less kind of like one role model that I'm kind of trying to shape myself onto and more, I think my experience really highlighted for me anyway, the importance of creating your own networks and supports. And so, so people at Kassel like Anna Engelhardt and Carolina Vestina were kind of, some of my best friends now, but at the beginning, very much my kind of peer supports, which were great.
Sounds inspiring and nice, so let's dig into your work and into the theories. What is water grabbing? And also maybe I didn't know where to start, because it's we can go from a theory down to the more practical empirical level. My question is, how is water grabbing and the water crisis, water scarcity, how is it linked to social or even class struggles? And how do you use the social reproduction theory. So maybe, yeah, it's I let you to choose where to begin.
Where to start? Yeah, I think it's useful to start from something like a concrete example, because maybe that's kind of where I started, and I think it builds a more specific image in our heads of what we're actually talking about. That will get us to the kind of the theory and the theoretical questions. So when I started, so this book is based on a lot of my PhD research, and when I started that project, when was it? 6 years ago, which 7 years ago. I was looking at these struggles over water. So I was looking at struggles specifically in Australia, which were mostly resisting the kind of gas commodity frontier and how it was overlapping with the water commodity frontier and also water, groundwater basins. And then also, at the time, and still continuing today, the push for further privatization and commercialization of water services globally, but particularly in my case, looking at the Republic of Ireland. And my questions were kind of like, well, what is going on here? How does this, how does this relate to class? Are these, so-called new social movements? Or are these movements that are, only talking about a kind of a limited kind of critique of our society, or do they have this kind of wider potential? And from everything that I was looking at, and also kind of being involved in, the way that people would, activists were talking about this, they were saying water is life. When we talk about the struggle for water, we're also talking about the struggle for democracy. These are kind of two big claims that are often made in the kind of water movements globally. And they were making links between each other. There's, sort of transnational water activist networks as well. And so it was really clearly not just a struggle over a specific amount of water and a resource or a service. There was something much bigger going on. But what I found when I was trying to kind of develop a framework of how to make sense of that is that the existing theories that I was looking at didn't really allow me to capture all of those linkages. And the kind of theories that I use are much more kind of a theory of internal relations. So it's rather than kind of atomizing a specific social movement, it's looking at the social movement as sort of a window onto a wider, what I call like a wider conjuncture, a wider perspective on kind of the world as it is at this moment. And so I started looking at, this kind of term water grabbing, which is used a lot by water activists. And obviously it comes from, or it has a lot of connections with the term land grabbing. And so there's a lot more established kind of scientific literature around land grabbing, which I think many people would already know. It's, kind of in simple terms, like the taking of land, often by transnational companies, to kind of reimagine it as sites of accumulation. And if you dig a little bit deeper, often what's behind these land grabs is a water grab, because land has very little value unless it has water. So, but the kind of discussions about what a water grab actually can include were much less developed at the time, sort of 7 or so years ago. And so, and when they were talking about water grabbing, it was much more in that way that I just said, the kind of the water behind the land. And what I wanted to do in this book, and I have been doing further in kind of other articles and research, is also thinking about water grabbing, not just as, the taking of water from a river or an aquifer, like a water resource, but also water services, water infrastructures, other points in the hydrosocial cycle where water can be reimagined as a site of accumulation or intensified accumulation, because in many cases it's already to a degree commodified. So anyway, thinking about these in kind of concrete examples led me down the track of theory and thinking about how to kind of theorize this. And I was clearly talking about, when we talk about water grabbing, it's kind of a concrete form of expropriation or primitive accumulation, but ongoing primitive accumulation. So it kind of already raised flags that I was kind of going down a more Marxist theoretical route. But then what is this relationship between expropriation and exploitation? If we think traditionally class is the relationship of exploitation, what does that mean for those people who potentially are landowners, you know? It's not a relationship of exploitation in these struggles necessarily. It is one of expropriation. So that, yeah, so I started to think, what is that relationship? And that kind of got me down sort of social reproduction theory, and this kind of eco-socialism and discussions around the role of nature and the role of kind of communities and labor in a really broad sense in the reproduction of capital. So that was kind of my journey, and it doesn't allow you to talk about everything, but it allows me to talk about the things that I found most important kind of in those struggles.
And in your introduction, you started with the question, why water and why now? And maybe it's a simple question, but it's important in order to grasp the whole context and the scope of this topic. So why is water important? I mean, if you go on a human or personal subjective dimension, everybody needs water. And as I did my research prior to the interview, a UN report highlighted that around 2 billion people, so a quarter of the world's population, do not have access to safe water. So there is, I mean, it's horrible. And on a geopolitical dimension, I discovered many years ago that there is tensions, border conflicts, and border disputes because of the threat of new dams and so on and so forth. So water could be used as a how can I say, a leverage effect and a geopolitical instrument, so to speak. So water is so, it's not simple H2O. So it's more than that. It's a huge topic. So now I'm asking you, why is water important?
Yeah, I think for all of the reasons you've outlined, but I think just on a one point there, you know, one of the actual initial questions that I started with is, what is water? And it's something we take for granted. It's something we turn the tap on. It's there, you know, we drink it, we need it. It's whatever, a huge amount of percentage of our body, and, you know, and so on. But actually defining what water is, okay, we know it's H2O, but how many other minerals can be included? When is it mud? When is it water? When is it a commodity? When is it a public good? All of these questions get raised in this very simple question of what actually is water. And that ended up being one of the kind of bigger questions of the book itself, in that, and my conclusion is that actually this is one of the questions that these struggles are struggling over, because there is no specific definition. And to reduce it purely to this measurement and this scientific measurement kind of reinforces the kind of depoliticization of what water is. Because as you said, water, you know, it flows through the global political economy on all levels, from conflict, interstate, intrastate, environment, social reproduction, services, working conditions, like all of these things water has an impact on. And I think when we think about like, why water, why now, you know, I think I have a different experience of it growing up in Australia, in that I grew up during the Millennium Drought. And so the absence of water was much more pressing than perhaps people who grew up in Europe, although that's definitely changing, unfortunately. But, you know, when I was a kid, there was adverts on the TV about, you know, showering with a friend, to save water. We weren't allowed to water our gardens before, after 6 a.m. There was heaps of water reduction strategies. And so water has always been something very much and very high on the kind of Australian political agenda. But then when I moved to Europe, it wasn't, until I'd say especially last year, when suddenly everything is in drought, the rivers aren't flowing, groundwater sources are being completely expropriated way too quickly, and so forth. So I found this an interesting kind of counter, in a way, of like, okay, my own personal experiences and seeing how people, say in Europe where I'm living at the moment, are navigating this new normal, which is much more of an absence of water. And it's not to say Australia does things well, because we definitely don't. But as you say, there was the last week was the UN conference on water and sanitation. It was sort of middle point conference, the first big UN conference in decades on water. And yeah, there's over 2 billion people who don't have access to safe drinking water and sanitation. But beyond that, that's when we think about kind of the water that comes or doesn't come out of our taps. We've also got to think about water as this incredibly relational thing. It's a flow resource. We can build new dams and try and control it, but it's never going to be completely controllable. It's going to evaporate. It's going to rain somewhere else. It's going to interact with its neighbors, its land, its minerals, and so forth. And so that's why I think it was last year, the US Geological Society kind of updated this map that we probably saw in primary school of, rain becomes, or water evaporates, it becomes rain, it becomes groundwater. It's, this thing we all drew when we were 7 years old, to include infrastructures and services and the actual socio part of the hydro-social cycle. Because they're saying, well, you can't talk about the flow of water anymore without talking about human impact. And, in my work, I would say, it's not all humans, it's specific classes of humans, and it's also specific social relations of production that mediate how water flows, where it flows, who it flows to, at what quality, and so forth. And so, it can be, and it often is reduced to this quite kind of scientific kind of hydrological research. But increasingly, which is a good thing, it's understood as an incredibly social and political resource. And that's also, as you mentioned, kind of, in conflicts, in ongoing conflicts, water is a tool of power. We see this, it was interesting, I was looking at some of the stuff. So Israel has some of the biggest desalination plants, and they're selling a lot of desal water to Jordan and neighboring countries, whilst at the same time turning off taps and flows to Palestinian communities. So again, you're seeing kind of water as this tool of geopolitical control in a way that on the surface could be not dismissed as not political, but kind of like, oh yeah, well, we need water, we need to buy water. So yeah, water, for me, water is super interesting because it impacts everything. Yeah,
absolutely. It's amazing how broad it is and how deep you can go into it. And there is also a philosophy behind it. I mean, not only the understanding of, is water a commodity, is water an economic good, or is it a public good? I mean, indigenous people see water more differently than under neoliberal capitalism. And so there is this old liberal philosophy, starting with John Locke and so on. So those who can prepare or work with it, they can use it. So Yeah, so maybe we can outline this philosophy of economic versus public good, and what philosophies are behind it. What is the reasoning behind it? I mean, you talked about accumulation, and maybe we can point out this philosophy.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the way that we understand water, or the dominant understanding of water, actually is quite representative of the sort of dominant ideological approaches of the time that it's talking to, which is not a huge surprise. But so I think it was in 1992 where one of the agencies of the UN, I've forgotten them now, but they designated water as an economic rather than a public good. And up until then, to a point, there'd been a long ongoing discussion, long discussion and debates. But up until then, water had been, to a degree, thought of as a public good. And that's where you see these huge, often very damaging to the environment, but state building exercises through new dam infrastructures, through public water services, because part of building your nation was to provide safe drinking water. Also, the expansion of urbanization required, taps and, clean water so that people weren't getting sick and so forth. So this interaction with health as well, health and urbanization. But from the kind of 1980s onwards, that shifted. And so water began to be more and more seen as not just a public good, but potential economic good. So it was, the most extreme example is Chile under Pinochet, with support from some of the large international finance institutions. They designated water as a potential private commodity that could be bought and sold, and like any other commodity. And so this, and the kind of water management policies that were then kind of put in practice after those shifts in the water code were all about kind of facilitating water as this kind of potential commodity. And we see the impacts of this, beyond Chile to Thatcher, outright sold England's different water infrastructures and services. So it was a full privatization. Normally they are not full privatizations, they're kind of public-private partnerships when more private actors and investment firms get involved. And then now we're seeing a kind of more complicated picture. So we're seeing, outright privatization actually hasn't been that profitable for many big companies, because water services are a natural monopoly. So if you disinvest, so you can pay shareholder profits, there's at some point where those leaky pipes fall apart. And if people don't have water, as we know, kind of all hell breaks loose because there is no replacement. And so actually that risk factor is really important. And many private companies or corporations don't want to shoulder the full risk of that. And so instead, there's been kind of, these private-public partnerships between states, where the states will kind of manage or take on some of that risk, and the more profitable aspects will be kind of privatized. But thinking about it kind of philosophically, and also seeing those kind of shifts from water as public good, to water as commodity, to water now as this kind of contested thing. Underpinning all of that is, as you said, like Indigenous understandings of water, and thinking about First Nations Australians. Water is a relative. It cannot be divisible from land and country. It's as much spiritual as it is a relation, rather than a specific thing. And so that's where trying to account for water in these ways that I've been talking about, the kind of the economic measurements and so forth, just ontologically cannot, they cannot account for these other types or understandings of what water is. And in many ways, what it does is kind of reproduces that kind of colonial erasure and kind of dispossession.
Sounds very interesting, yes. You mentioned also this public-private partnerships. Here is my question. What kind of actors are involved in defining, understanding what has a private or public good? For example, in your book, you mentioned the World Bank Group. There are also other state actors and so on. And also my next question is, what role plays the nation state in this accumulation regime? You mentioned in this book, there is a whole chapter, the strategic selectivities of the state. So I believe you referred to Bob Jessop and this whole theory of selectivity. And could you explain us
of course.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, well, the state is an absolutely critical actor in these processes. So expropriation of water, whether it's services or resources, couldn't happen without the state, because usually it's through shifting regulations, and those shifting regulations occur through sometimes very dodgy, sometimes less dodgy relationships with different corporations or partnerships. And if we're thinking about Jessop here as well, some of his arguments of, if we think about also what neoliberalism means for the state, it's not an erasure or a kind of winding back of the state. It's rather the reformulation of the state in the service of the market, in the service of kind of private capital. So that's what we're seeing with the role of the state in kind of water services and also water resources. And that's what I tried to do in the book, in the sense that Australia is really about water resources. And so the enclosure of aquifers and rivers and so forth for the facilitation of the gas commodity frontier. Whereas in the Republic of Ireland, it's about the attempt to privatize water services, in part to help the recovery, or so-called recovery, from the global financial crisis and sort of debt restructuring. So in both of these cases, the state is a willing and eager partner and facilitator of the interests of transnational capital in different forms. So, thinking about what that, who those different actors are in shifting from, a public to an economic good, we could also say that that kind of reflects the shifting ethos of the state in a really broad kind of abstract term of a kind of public nation building state, in maybe the so-called kind of golden years of capitalism, to a neoliberal state, and therefore kind of economic rationalities as being the dominant underpinning of all aspects of policy, not just economic policy.
And what is the implication for democracy? I mean, if we understand nature and water as a commodity, and if we privatize it, who owns it? And then there is the question of democracy and the state, the role of the state. If, for example, profitable parts are sold to private corporations, but then the less profit parts are, I mean, there is a division, an uneven play. So what has it to do with democracy and our understanding of democracy?
Yeah, completely. And this is where, many of the people in different water movements have said, when we call for the protection of water, we're calling for the protection of democracy as well. And democracy here being much more than just representational democracy, but I suppose accountability. I think the key word is accountability, because exactly, in the example that you give, if the profitable parts of a water service or water infrastructures are sold off, which is really good for short-term budget management because you've got suddenly a big influx of cash. But over the long term, you no longer have those revenue streams of water bills and so forth. What that means is that the state or the municipality, often municipality when it's water services, has outsourced accountability, but hasn't expanded the mechanisms for accountability to those private companies. So if we think about the quite limited mechanisms of accountability that we have in representational democracies, it's voting at different levels of elections, it's potentially petitioning representatives and so forth. We don't have that when it's Veolia, for example, one of the big French water multinationals. Who do we petition in that case? Where sometimes they will have in these contracts spaces for community consultation, but often it's only around the end of a concession, which is the kind of a short term, or not short term, often 20 to 30 years long contract to manage that service. And consultations can be tick box exercises, or they can be real consultations. So when we think about the impacts of democracy, is that we're thinking more and more about how, with the increased kind of parcelization or kind of outsourcing of these sorts of services, formerly public services or nature, to private entities and private interests, what we're also doing is kind of walling off what can be political, what can be contested within the given terrain of what is acceptable politics. And that means that there's less and less and less of what is actually understood as kind of up for democratic kind of consideration, I suppose, which is, really problematic. I can't hear you. I think the microphone might have gone off.
Oh, sorry. That part of your book impressed me, but also depressed me to some sort of to some degree, because you mentioned this dominant approach, integrated water resource management, and there you described that, for example, this approach can depoliticize water management. And also excludes alternative understandings of water and so on and so forth. So, and nowadays, because I'm in the peace studies and peace movement, and what scares me is this securitization of such commodities, of such goods, of such public goods, and nowadays we see it as a potential of conflict and war. Even and it's scary. It
is. I think on that point, maybe to try and make it less depressing, is that water, and there's two kind of big schools of thought around this, and I don't want to totally dismiss integrated water resource management, because there has been some really good things that have come out of it. It's actually treats water as a river basin, the whole, rather than, okay, Austria starts here, we no longer look at, the river that flows that way or that way, and has tried to bring in more different interests and interest groups into the management of water as a resource. But behind that is then private interests, and economic valuations have tended to dominate, which is where the kind of the gate opens to then these things like speculation and risk management and so forth in potentially problematic ways around securitization. But thinking about water conflicts, there's two schools of thought. There's one that says, behind many of the most recent wars and physical conflicts has been questions of water. And then there's others who say, actually, the necessity to manage water that in a way that, because water does not respect boundaries or borders that we've drawn on a map arbitrarily, potentially, also can facilitate cooperation. And so you've kind of got to hold both. I would position myself somewhere in the middle. I think both are true, and you've got to kind of hold both as potentials, because it is clear that water is, a critical resource that is going to become more and more critical if we don't do enough to manage it and to engage properly with these problems. But perhaps because of that necessity, it also has this potential for kind of peace and cooperation.
I understand. You held a public lecture on the topic of social reproduction theory in the University of Kassel, which can be seen on YouTube. And there you mentioned many contradictions, and it also applies to water. There is this contradiction of labor and capital. And then there is, of course, nature and capital, as we see in the water crisis. But also there is this question of how can labor be reproduced, so the social reproduction comes into play. Maybe we can go deeper into this topic, into this theory, because it's also important in understanding the water crisis.
Yeah, of course. And that's the kind of theoretical framework that I tried to develop and push forward in the book, in that most social reproduction theory, it started from a kind of a feminist position and a feminist starting point, looking at domestic labor, wages for housework, in the big campaigns in the 70s. And this question of what makes the worker work ready. So everything that goes into making the worker work ready. And that, the worker does not just turn up, at the factory door and reproduce surplus labor and surplus value and, then profit is made, but rather how does that worker get to that door? And this can be seen narrowly in the sense of, the kind of biological and care labor that goes into cooking, cleaning, sexual reproduction and so forth. And it can also be expanded to include neighborhoods, public services. In this way, the state is increasingly, or perhaps decreasingly, actually involved in the reproduction of social reproduction. In the welfare state, it was kind of intrinsic to it. And then what I was thinking in the book is also the role of nature in, the necessity for social reproduction. So if we think about the reproduction of labor, or, I think Marx also talks about this, the inputs needed for surplus value production is land and labor. Another way to think about it is labor and nature. So these are the kind of, in Nancy Fraser's terms, these are the conditions that make accumulation possible. Also the state being a sort of institutional condition. And so while most social reproduction theory does take a specifically gendered lens, because often it's women doing this work, looks specifically at the household, the home, or community, I wanted to bring these two different dimensions of, water being a public service, something that flows actually through the house, pipes, and it is necessary for cooking, for cleaning, for everything. But water also as a resource, as a river, as an aquifer, being nature here, kind of clear definition of nature, but even as nature, the necessary condition for the social reproduction of those communities that live on those waterscapes. So that's where I tried to kind of work through, or kind of muddle through in a way, these different contradictions that you mentioned, the kind of labor capital, nature capital, but also labor nature. Because, we may analytically separate these spheres, but, in our day-to-day, historically and so forth, they're very much intertwined and kind of entangled with one another.
Yeah, and also there is this dimension in your book. You go also deep into Australians' history, settler colonial project, and so on and so forth, the expropriation of indigenous people. And this has all to do with primitive accumulation. And so, yeah, like feminists pointed out that reproductive work, care work, and so on and so forth is cheap. Nature is cheap. And so it is with the land of the indigenous. It's there, so we can grab it.
Yeah, totally.
It's a colonial logic that lies behind it. And nowadays, as you mentioned in your book, also there are these new extractive industries. And here you answered it a little bit, but maybe I can ask you again, how similar or how different is the situation in Ireland and Australia? Because you, in your book, you did research, you conducted interviews with both people and actors from Ireland and Australia. And how different are these cases, and what are the similarities?
Yeah, so it's when I first try and explain, like bringing these on the surface, quite different countries and also quite different struggles. And okay, water is the kind of commonality there, but one is about, one is in Europe and is about the potential privatization of a public service and water services, so it's a sort of infrastructures and services. And the other one, is about the interaction of the gas commodity frontier and the water commodity frontier, embedded in these kind of very ongoing colonial relations of dispossession. So on the surface, they look quite distinct. But my goal in bringing them together was to explain that, or kind of demonstrate these two examples of water grabbing as being reflective of one another, even if they're different nodal points in this hydrosocial cycle. So the further deeper you get, actually, there's very similar processes of expropriation happening. And the process of expropriation, in farming communities in Australia, because the taking of water for the gas industry meant that there was no more water or less water for agriculture, which after decades of drought is, highly problematic. This, interestingly, has meant that, agricultural communities who were once, at the frontier of, Australian kind of capitalism and colonial expansion, they were the ones sort of driving Indigenous people off their land, are now themselves being dispossessed by new forms of sort of transnational capital that are now more, super profit industries rather than agriculture. Whereas in Ireland, this experience of dispossession, is more complicated because it's not more complicated. It's just a different example. It's, these working class communities had they were central to the independence narrative, but basically from day one of independence were always peripheral to the state project. And so this experience of dispossession or displacement, was nothing new. But again, there was a similar experience of kind of displacement, dispossession, of kind of new communities being kind of rendered newly highly vulnerable for the interests of transnational capital in partnership with the state. So in both cases, that's the kind of overall narrative that you get, is that, you know, there's these similar dynamics, even if the role that water plays and the role or the kind of specifics of those communities looks quite different.
So my last question is, let's end positive. There is a lot going on. For example, on the 28th of July on 2010, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a historical resolution recognizing the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right. So there is a lot going on. And in 2012, there was this European Citizen Initiative declaring also water as a human right, 1.9 million signatures and so on. And yeah, there is a lot going on. Also, I read something of Professor Naho Mirumachi. I believe I spell it wrong, but okay. And she advocates for a human right-based approach. So yeah, to tackle this crisis. So my question is, let's end positive. What are the struggles? I believe you, in your book, you mentioned the term conjuncture, if I'm right. So what, and also the you mentioned earlier in the beginning of our interview, the workers' union, the trade unions. So what role can also workers' unions play in this struggle? How can they support this struggle? And yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I will try and end on a positive note. I think what we're seeing with all these discussions about the right to water is that it is a good discursive tool, because rights are something that are quite accepted. They're things that people in general will not say, oh, I'm against, you know, human rights, blah, blah, blah. So in this way, it was a really big success to get a UN right to water and sanitation. Also, now we have a special rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation since that occurred. And the current special rapporteur, Pedro is, you know, he comes from the water movements, so he's very institutionally supportive of things that are going on, which is great. What we also, but that doesn't mean that it's settled. And so there's big discussions about, does the human right to water preclude water being understood as an economic right? Or, yeah, what does it mean? Like, what does it concretely mean? And we're still in that space. So this is still very much an open question, open debate within UN organizations. We saw this also in the conference last week. You know, what, if we say everyone has a human right to water, does that preclude certain, you know, financial actors and investments, or do we need to use whatever tools we've got to get, you know, more money going to get more water services and so forth? So I think that's a watch this space thing. I'm not completely convinced that we're going in the right direction around that. We also look at the European Citizens Initiative. Nothing, the European Union, like nothing concretely has happened since that. It's been 10 years. So it was a great mobilizing tool. It was a big success. But whether it's had a huge amount of concrete impact on the way that Europe manages water and the right to water, I'm not 100% convinced. That doesn't mean it wasn't a really useful tool. Thinking about struggles at the moment that we can get behind, and you know, I think water actually has this incredible mobilizing potential because of its necessity, because there's nothing that replaces it. And we've seen this over the last, you know, especially the last decade or so, in that, you know, in Ireland, the trade unions were central to the right to water movement. they were funding it, they were central organizers, because they saw one of the arguments was, or the unions that were involved, they argued that working conditions don't just stop, at the factory gate, at the, door to your business or whatever. It's also, the worker is a person in a home, in a community, and we need to protect those conditions that allow that worker to be work ready. So the social reproduction behind it. In Greece, trade unions were incredibly active in actually, I think the plumbers union reconnected people who'd been cut off from the kind of privatization following restructuring after the last financial crisis. And I think we're increasingly seeing more and more trade unions and kind of workers' struggles interacting with environmental struggles, understanding that water struggles are not just environmental struggles. And I mean that in a kind of broad sense. I don't know enough about what's going on in France at the moment, but some of these big protests around the reservoirs that are being proposed, and also, it's a fear, from what I understand anyway, there's a fear there that these huge reservoirs will be a water grab by the largest kind of agro-industry actors in that space. And this will be negative for smaller producers, but also for the environment. And there seems to be links being made between those struggles and, pensions and everything else that's kicking off in France at the moment. So again, we're seeing these kind of natural alliances that are kind of being made. So in that way, I think usually in many of these water struggles, there's a way for all types of kind of political activists to get involved.
Yeah, and there are also some nice small tools. For example, I installed an app. It's called Boycott. It's like a synonym for buying and boycott. And there you can have the whole list, for example, Coca-Cola or Nestle, and you can see what do they own, what products do they sell, and so on and so forth. So, and also I believe it got an impact of the environment. So it's a nice tool. Yeah, it's a nice tool. So there are small things and yeah, some positive ways of struggling. Struggle is actually a positive thing.
Yeah, I think struggle is productive.
Yeah,
it's not just productive for hopefully having an impact on things, but also it's productive for our own well-being.
Absolutely. Yeah, Madelaine, I thank you very much for your time. It was a great pleasure reading your book and talking to you about your ideas and concepts. And yeah, I enjoyed it and it was a pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it too. So.
Thank you.